attacks and then responds with hostile tweets attacking his critics. His critics then point out those tweets as evidence that Trump is every bit as bad as they said he was, and so on. Well, the latest installment of the saga took place over the weekend. CNN political analyst David Gergen warned that Trump's criticism of the media proves he's a would-be dictator. Watch.
Discrediting Mueller, discrediting what may come out through the Justice Department from Mueller, discrediting the press that will be reporting on what Mueller does. This is what split the country apart, and it is the beginnings, in many other countries, it's been the beginnings of an authoritarian rule, and that's the larger threat hanging over us now.
Well, that's kind of hilarious. The irony, of course, is that David Gergen spent much of his own career in government, not simply criticizing reporters, but actively lying to them, as is the custom. Was that the behavior of a despot? Pretty funny. But pause and consider this seriously for a minute. Authoritarianism, that's what our ruling class says it fears. They tell us that all the time. Okay, let's say you really were an authoritarian and you wanted to weaken American democracy and impose a kind of oligarchy on the country. How would you go about doing that? Well, you'd probably start by trying to control what people say and think. If citizens dissented from the mandated orthodoxy or dared to consider unauthorized ideas, you'd target them. You'd shame them on social media. You'd shout them down in public. You'd get them fired from their jobs. You'd make sure everybody was afraid to disagree with you. After that, you would work to disarm the population. You'd take their guns away. That way, they'd be entirely dependent on you for their safety, not to mention unable to resist your plans for them. Then, just to make sure you'd quelled all opposition, you'd systematically target any institution that might oppose or put brakes on your power. You'd be especially concerned about churches, the family, and independent businesses. You'd be certain to undermine and crush those using laws and relentless propaganda. If, despite all of that, election results still didn't go your way, you'd use an entrenched, unelected bureaucracy to neuter any leader you hadn't handpicked yourself. But you'd be shaken by an election like that. You'd resolve never to allow one again. And to make sure of that, you'd work tirelessly to replace the old and ungrateful population with a new and more obedient one. That's what you do. Sound familiar? We're not talking about Donald Trump. For all of his faults, Trump isn't doing any of that. Our ruling class is. And that's what all these issues are really about. The speech codes, the calls for gun control, the relentless attacks on the nuclear family, the demands for unlimited mass immigration. None of that is designed to help you. None of it will make you happier or more prosperous. That's not the point. The point is to make you more dependent on the very people who are yelling at you right now on cable television. They're the authoritarians. Mark Stein is an author and columnist, and he joins us tonight. Mark, authoritarians. It's a little ironic that these people are calling the population that while they're simultaneously trying to control the population by any means necessary.
Exactly, Tucker. And in fact, the reason they wound up with Donald Trump getting elected president is because they've got a long tradition of doing this to any Republican. They did it to Bush. They did it to Mitt Romney, who's the very definition of a milquetoast, and yet they managed to claim that he was some kind of Nazi because he stuck his dog on the car and drove the dog to Canada or whatever it was. And in the end, Donald Trump was the only guy who could withstand the kind of careless demonization that goes on. And it's interesting to me, you gave all those examples of the authoritarian trends on the left. There were lots of other ones, too. I mean, David Gergen didn't get upset when Sheldon Whitehouse, a Democrat senator, proposed that people who disagree with his views on climate change should be subject to criminal prosecution.
Exactly.
He didn't worry about the authoritarian temptation when the Democrats in the Senate voted effectively to neuter the First Amendment. He didn't bemoan the trend towards authoritarianism when the previous administration weaponized both the Justice Department and the IRS to go after its ideological enemies. And worst of all, he didn't bemoan the trend towards authoritarianism when dozens of Democrat legislators, before Trump had even set foot in the office, decided to boycott his inauguration, which is the very defining act of a free society, the peaceful transfer of power.
That's right.
David Gergen didn't whimper a word when dozens of Democrats decided they were going to boycott that inauguration.
He seemed deeply unconcerned. I was thinking this weekend, why is it, what all these issues have in common, though, gun control, mass immigration, particularly attacks on the nuclear family, male-headed households, the patriarchy, they never let up with that. What is that about? And it seems to me that the family is the final bulwark against the spread of government power. You're loyal to your family first. When you stop being loyal to your family first, you can be controlled.
Yes, and I would say actually that one of the most disturbing trends, there's an Indian professor in Bangalore who bemoans the way essentially Western leftists have nationalized the family. They started off by, you know, nationalizing the mines and the car industry, and when all that didn't work, they actually figured out it's best just to cut to the chase and nationalize the family. And you know, what matters in any society is the intervening institutions between the individual and the government. You mentioned the family, you mentioned the church. It's also things like town government and county government. And when you have serious revolutions like the Soviets and the French, they abolish all of those. In the Soviet case, they did go very far towards abolishing the family. We've got something slightly different, as we've seen in Florida, where you have vast, essentially, you've got government social services, you've got government police agencies at multiple levels monitoring someone, and they're actually, you know, these things are not as effective as, in fact, a functioning family and letting parents raise their children, as opposed to having doctors determine that your 7-year-old is going through a bit of a phase, so let's him get him transitioning into a girl. They're at war with all the intervening agencies between centralized power and the individual.
And it's not an accident. Brilliant analysis. I always learn something when you're on. Mark Steyn, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Tucker.
Well, this past weekend was not a high point for responsible political analysis, to put it mildly, following Special Counsel Robert Mueller's indictment against 13 Russians for alleged meddling during the last election. President Trump tweeted this, quote, "Obama was president up to and beyond the 2016 election. Why didn't he do something about Russian meddling?" Well, so that's a fair question, whether you like the tweet or not. But the media were not impressed at all. Various ersatz Russia experts competed on cable television to see who could find the most over-the-top analogy to express their outrage. The Washington Post's Karen Tumulty nearly won with this one. Watch.
You look at the president's tweets this morning and try to imagine if Franklin D. Roosevelt, after Pearl Harbor, had gotten on the radio and said that Tokyo was laughing at us, to use a little less crude phrase than he did. Sure. That is not what is called upon a president to do right now.
You know what's going to happen, though, Karen? Someone on Fox News is going to take what you just said. They're going to say, how dare you compare this to Pearl Harbor?
It is an attack on our country. It is an attack on our country with use of 21st century means, and it is definitely a national security threat.
Yeah, someone on Fox News might be reasonable and subject the analogy to critical analysis. So here it is. Pearl Harbor, that, of course, was a sneak attack by the Japanese Imperial military that killed almost 3,000 Americans. It led, of course, to 4 years of global war. Yeah. That's almost identical to Russians taking out Facebook ads before the last election. Meanwhile, over on Twitter, Max Boot of the Washington Post compared the whole thing to, inevitably, 9/11. Boot tweeted this, quote, "Imagine if after 9/11 the president saw the attack as a political embarrassment to be minimized rather than as a national security threat to be combated. That's roughly where we stand after the second worst foreign attack on America in recent decades." Huh. Let's see, after 9/11, we gave up long-standing civil liberties. We invaded 2 countries. We began a nearly endless series of minor interventions across the globe that have killed thousands of U.S. soldiers and hundreds of thousands of other people. If Max Boot had his way, we would have attacked Iran also. We may still, at his urging. Is his suggestion now we bomb Moscow? Actually, don't ask. You don't want to know the answer. But let's pause and think about this in a non-hysterical way for a minute with facts, if possible. Obviously, we ought to acknowledge that Russians tried to meddle in our election, because they did. But scale matters here and everywhere, and here's what actually happened during the 2016 election. According to Facebook, their own numbers, Russian-linked companies spent a total of $46,000 on ads before the election. That's less than what it cost to buy a new Chevy Suburban, by the way. By contrast, the Trump and Clinton campaigns spent a combined total of $81 million. That's not including all the online advertising by various interest groups like the NRA or Planned Parenthood, NARAL, AFL, CIO, a million more. So Russian spending did not amount to much, but it was also badly targeted, comically so. For example, 5 times as many Russian ads were run in Maryland, a bright blue state, as in Wisconsin, which was on the line. Most of the Facebook ads in Wisconsin, by the way, went up prior to the Wisconsin primary. That's well before the general election. And none of those ads mentioned Trump. Details matter. Washington, D.C., which is the single most Democratic place in the country, 90% for Hillary, more than 90%, received more targeted ads from the Russians than Pennsylvania, which in the end, as you remember, went to Trump, and so on. As any political consultant could tell you, if you bothered to ask, ads like this accomplish nothing. They're a joke. And the Russians weren't much more effective offline in the real world. The rallies they organized on Facebook attracted almost no attendees, with one exception, an anti-Trump rally that was organized after the election solely for the sake of undermining the results of that election. So this was a minuscule operation that succeeded only by accident with the complicity of our news media. The goal was to undermine American society by fueling political division, and the Russians must be pleased by their handiwork, not because Trump was elected, but because our talking heads apparently share their goal of undermining faith in the results of a fair election. Chris Hahn is a former aide to Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, and he joins us tonight. So, Chris, I mean, if you look at the actual facts here, and this is not a defense of anybody meddling in our system, which is universal, as you know, since you know a million people, as I do, who work for other countries trying to influence our policy. It's everywhere. But in this case, I'm not defending it. I'm just saying, let's be real. They did not a single thing of any effect at all. It was ludicrous. They spent more in D.C. than Pennsylvania. What?
Well, the ads are just part of what they did. They had thousands of fake identities on Facebook and Twitter that were rallying against the election of Hillary Clinton. Now, I'm not saying that that determined the election, but they surely were meddling in the election, and that's why 530 out of 535 members of Congress overwhelmingly voted for sanctions against Russia as a result of this, and the president, to this day, still has refused to enact them.
Okay, look, those are two separate questions. I mean, like, how honest do you want to be about the extent to which our policy is determined by the priorities of other countries? Let's be totally real. The fact that the overwhelming majority of Congress voted to do anything is not a sign it was a good idea or a proportionate response. Sanctions against Russia are a good idea if they help American strategic priorities, and a bad idea if they don't. And so, I mean, let's just address the facts. What specifically did the Russians, and I'm not defending the Russians, I'm just saying, compared to what? The Chinese, the Saudis? I mean, you want to talk real interference in our country? I mean, seriously.
Look, they were spending over $1 million a month in violation of our federal campaign finance laws. They were involved with our election. Now, whether or not that had an effect, I don't know. But they were meddling. H.R. McMaster even agrees that they were meddling. The only person who seems to not want to take action on this is the president of the United States.
Take action? Are you aware? Hold on. Let's just be real. And I just want to say, for the record, that I'm totally opposed to this, okay? So for any critics say, you never criticize the president, let me criticize the president by saying I think what we're doing in Syria is contrary to American interest, to put it mildly. But we are fighting Russia in Syria right now. We just killed a bunch of Russian citizens in Syria. Is that enough? Does that make you feel better about him not being a Russian agent? We're killing Russians.
You know what? I think the response needs to be very similar to the response we had for the Sony hack, where we responded proportionally with other cyber methods, which this country is perfectly capable of doing. And there are sanctions that the Congress voted on that the president should enact.
But please don't ignore my point, because it's a real one. Isn't it a little implausible to describe the president as a tool of Putin when we're killing Russians in Syria and opposing? Look, Russia's only base outside its own borders is in Syria, and we're challenging that militarily with thousands of Americans. That's not significant to you?
We're not intentionally engaging the Russians in Syria. We're not intentionally killing Russians in Syria.
Yes, we are.
To the extent
That's not
that
true.
any Russians
that is not true. That's
to
not
the
true.
extent any Russians are being hurt in Syria, that is not an
that
intentional
is factually
action of the
untrue.
United States of America.
They were killed by a drone. And it was clear that there was Russian military equipment they were in, and they were Russian contractors, and that was clear too, and we killed them. Now, a lot on the left are happy about that. They want a war with Russia. Max Boot is agitating for one. I'm against it.
I don't want a war with anybody. I want to be very clear.
Well, we're getting one thanks to the lunatic rhetoric of the left, which is pushing this administration into a totally counterproductive
530
war.
members of Congress are not the left, Tucker. 530 members of Congress are mostly Republicans because they mostly control Congress.
But it doesn't make their judgment wise. I don't care if it's every single member of Congress, every city council and Illinois member. I don't care. That you can't justify that on the grounds that it helps America, because it doesn't.
Every intelligence agency in this country says that the Russians are still meddling in our democracy. And let me tell you something, the next time it might not help your side. It might be time for us to act
helping
right now
anybody's
on this.
side.
And
do you think, let me ask you a question, do you think the Saudis are meddling in our democracy more or less than the Russians are? What about the Chinese? Right now, do you think that?
I don't know, and I don't want to
guess. Oh, you don't know? You don't seem that interested in learning.
I would assume that they are.
Oh, yeah, well, they are.
I would assume that they are.
So if you compare the amount of money that the Saudi kingdom should we should we impose sanctions against Saudi Arabia? I'm just saying, let's be real.
We should impose sanctions on the Saudi Arabia because we don't need their oil anymore because we've got our own fuel sources.
What about China?
We don't need
what about
them
China,
anymore.
which is hacked into every mainframe the U.S. government maintains? Should we impose sanctions against China?
And the president during his campaign said he would act against China, yet he hasn't.
Do you think we should impose sanctions on China right now?
I think if they're engaged in cyber warfare against this country, we should respond in kind, and we should respond in kind, and we should impose sanctions, and we should bring them to the table to get them to stop.
Should we kill Chinese soldiers, do you think?
No, I don't think we should kill anybody. I am not for a hot war with any of these people.
But you're for sanctions against China
going on, and we have a president.
You get credit for honesty.
The president is right. Hold on. The president is right when he says that they're laughing at us in Moscow. They're laughing that they continue to do it and nobody's doing anything about it.
This is a joke,
and that's
man.
The president's
Russia
job.
is essentially a third world country that poses no long-term threat to us. China is taking over the world. And we're ignoring it because we're obsessed with this.
It's funny what you can do with a laptop and a troll farm.
Yeah, nothing, actually.
It's funny what you could do with a laptop and a troll farm.
All right, we're out of time. Chris Hahn, thank you. You are game, and I appreciate it.
Thanks, Tucker.
The press is fixated on guns, but it could be our own media who are turning kids into violent killers. Not a crazy idea, actually. We've got details.
You totaled your brand new car. Nobody's hurt, but there will still be pain.
Last week's shooting in Parkland, Florida has sparked renewed demands for gun control across the country. Of course, America's gun ownership rate used to be a lot higher than it is today. Yet deadly school shootings are mostly a recent phenomenon. What has changed? Could it be our overall culture has undergone a toxic shift? Matt Bevin is the governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. He recently suggested that violent video games and TV shows have created a, quote, desensitized culture. The governor joins us tonight. Governor, thanks for coming on.
Great to be on with you, Tucker.
So, that is kind of the question. I mean, fewer American households own guns than did 50 years ago, and yet we didn't have school shootings. What do you think the difference is between then and now?
Yeah, I think the thing is to ask ourselves what has changed, because your point is well taken. If gun ownership itself has not changed, and if in fact it's not, there are more gun restrictions now. There are more rules about who can or can't own a gun or how a gun might be acquired than there were 50 and 100 years ago. And yet 50 and 100 years ago, children did not slaughter other children at school. What has changed? It isn't the gun. So something culturally has changed. And I would submit that we have become significantly desensitized to death and to violence. And we are training children, whether we intend to or not, whether it's anyone's desire or not, through video games, through movies, through musical lyrics, through television shows, increasingly during prime time even. The amount of violence is increasingly realistic, increasingly graphic, and there is a cost to this. You couple that with the number of psychiatric drugs that children and adults, for that matter, are on, and the fact that our mores as a society have shifted to the degree that they're largely non-existent, that we no longer have these clear delineated right and wrong boundaries, that everything is somewhat gelatinous. And these children are increasingly coming from broken homes as well, and they find themselves rudderless. then you're a father and you understand it's important. What happens at home has a profound impact on what your children do out there. Too many children don't have the blessings of having a stable environment at home. And we have to look at what has changed in society and not have a knee-jerk response that another rule and another regulation is the answer.
So everything you've said makes sense. I haven't seen the social science on it, but it doesn't sound crazy at all. It seems kind of obvious. Why, if you could just sum up quickly, why do you think saying what you just said gets such a hostile reaction from a lot of people? Why do they hate to hear that?
It does not fit the narrative that people want. And for 1,000 reasons, people have a preconceived notion that another gun restriction, for example, another rule, another regulation, another you can't do this, another governmental intervention of some sort is the answer. When in fact, nobody wants to look at what they have to look at if it's not that. And that is what our responsibility is in society as individuals, as parents, as teachers, as educators, as people in the churches and civic organizations and youth organizations. What are we not doing that was done a generation ago to provide the type of guidance that young people need as they grow up? And not the least of which is how you deal with differences of opinion. And I'll tell you one other thing, too, that I've not said, although I'm sure this will make people's heads explode in some regard as well. We are lionizing, sadly, some of these children who do this. Yeah. Again, not anyone's intention, but we're making heroes of a child who has no business to have their face put out there. Another young person who's in the balance, who's perhaps psychologically unbalanced, is going to say, why not? I'll get my 15 minutes worth of fame. If we don't think that there's a copycat mentality, we're not paying attention.
That's the nature of the internet. Governor, thank you. That was really interesting. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman is the author of the book Assassination Generation, and he joins us tonight. Colonel, thanks for coming on. So,
thanks for having me on board, Tucker. Hey, you just said, you haven't seen the social science on it yet. Here it is.
Well, that's why I wanted. That's why I wanted to talk to you. So, this is the kind of idea that gets dismissed as crankish immediately by people who know nothing. The idea that violent video games and entertainment. Right. Well, that's exactly right.
Yeah,
so what do we know about it? What is the social science on it? What is the evidence?
The AMA, the APA, the American Academy of Pediatrics, Surgeon General after Surgeon General have made definitive statements. Where the matter came before the Supreme Court, California law to regulate children's access to violent video games, the video game industry found 82 journalism professors. Now think about it, 82 media studies professors who told the Supreme Court there is no scientific proof. It was academic malfeasance at the highest level. Our entire medical community screaming from the mountainside. One of the dissenting justices in the Supreme Court case said, I'm not a medical expert, but I know who is. And it's not 82 journalism professors, our entire medical community, thousands of sound scholarly studies telling us.
I can't imagine anybody I'd rather take advice from than journalism professor. I can't imagine a dumber group of people.
Amen.
Actually.
Amen.
It's unbelievable.
The malfeasance of journalism professors making a joint statement to the Supreme Court. But Tucker, here's what's important. Please look at this. It was 2002, an identical crime happened in Germany. 19-year-old high school dropout in Erfurt, Germany, murders 17 people at a school. Identical crime. Germany, 2002. It's not about the guns. Germany can't stop it. We saw this weekend a massacre in a church in Russia. Russia's a totalitarian nation that's tried to confiscate every gun for a century, and they can't stop evil people from getting guns. The most horrific juvenile mass murder in history, a 17-year-old kid in 2009 in Witten, Germany, murdered 15 people. Germany can't stop it. Russia can't stop it. It's not about taking away rights.
Well, I
noticed
noticed
about giving people more right.
But why are the media so hesitant to go after the big businesses that are profiting from this garbage? That's a question I'd like to explore in greater
voter
detail.
Base and their,
I know.
It's their donor base and their voter base. They know that they've lost the gun owners. They know that they've lost those votes. And to attack the gun owners, and especially to protect the video game industry, this is their donor base.
Well, that's exactly right. Lieutenant Colonel, thank you. I appreciate it, and I agree with you.
Hey, one last thing, Tucker, if I could.
Yeah.
We're teaching the kids that we need sheepdogs out there. We don't need more wolves. We don't need more sheep. We need sheepdogs. I originated the whole sheepdog concept. The Sheepdog Kids book, Assassination Generation. We're changing the world, Tucker. There's hope for America, and it begins with you. Thank you for what you do.
I appreciate it. Thanks. The left is extolling Russia's election meddling as a hyper-efficient hacking effort, but data suggest they were actually deeply, deeply incompetent. That story next.
I have no clue. We're just TV doctors. If this was a real emergency, I'd be freaking out. We are the TV doctors of America.
Together with Cigna reminding you
to go, know, and take control of your health.
Schedule your annual checkup today.
Former Hillary Clinton campaign chairman John Podesta had a hilarious exchange this weekend on CBS. Nancy Cordes asked why the Russians seemed more capable of targeting swing states than the Hillary campaign did. Watch this.
How is it that these Russian operatives knew to focus on purple states like Michigan and Wisconsin, and your campaign didn't?
Well, of course, we spent a lot of time and energy and effort in all those states.
Hillary Clinton herself did not spend much time in those states.
In the end of the day, we fell short in those states, and I think that this active measures effort by the Russians could have tilted the election in Donald Trump's favor.
Keep telling yourself that. Actually, the Russians turned out not to be very good campaign operatives. They were terrible at targeting swing states. According to Robert Mueller's indictments, they didn't even know what a purple state was until 2016. Just a few $100 were spent on key states like Michigan and Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, thousands were wasted in states like California and Maryland that obviously were going Democrat from day one, and did. Cleta Mitchell is an attorney and a renowned campaign finance expert who's been around a long time watching campaigns. She joins us in the studio. So, Cleta, if you were attempting to defeat Donald Trump, or rather Hillary Clinton in favor of Trump, would you have done what the Russians did?
Well, I would have spent a lot more than $100,000 or $46,000 or whatever number it is that the Senate Intelligence Committee actually heard testimony from Facebook that they can only account for $46,000 having been spent. Total.
So why are we hearing $1 million a month? I just heard that.
I know. I heard it today, too. I think that it's in the Democratic talking points. They keep having to change the facts so that they can make it look like there was a lot more.
But does that number come from anywhere authoritative?
Not that I've seen. The testimony from Facebook was that it was $46,000. Testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee, the hearing, was that it was in the neighborhood of $100,000.
So total. So just to put, okay, so this was the most expensive presidential campaign ever waged by anybody in the history of the world. So $46,000. Put that in perspective. If I were running for, I don't know, the Wyoming's 1 congressional district, that seat, would I spend $46,000? Would that be enough?
You'd spend a lot more than that if you were running for an at-large seat in Wyoming. Or look, I mean, the campaigns, the Trump campaign and the Hillary Clinton campaign together spent $81 million on Facebook.
Just on Facebook?
On social media.
Yeah.
Social media. Now, that doesn't count all the super PACs. It doesn't count the party committees. Just the 2 campaigns. So the money that was spent by the Russians on social media was a drop in the bucket. And as Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein said the other day, there's no evidence it influenced the outcome of the election.
How many lobbyists here in Washington do you know who spend more on lunch every year than the Russians spend on Facebook?
Well, I don't know. I don't get their lunch expense reimbursement. It's a
so
lot.
Look, I just want to be totally clear. I'm against foreign intervention in our elections, in our policies. Though it's universal. But would you say, compared to the efforts of other governments to influence the way this country operates, that this is a big effort or a small effort?
Well, I think, you know what, Tucker, you asked, that's a really good question, because frankly, I think Andy McCarthy in National Review over the weekend made a really good point, which is, why is this being treated as a lawsuit? This is counterintelligence. This is what should be dealt with by our defense and intelligence agencies, not by a prosecutor filing a criminal indictment against people who are not in the United States, and this is never going to go to trial.
No, I know.
So it's kind of all...
because it's inherently political. It's a political kabuki.
It's a political kabuki.
To make the ruling class feel better about itself for losing
Well, you know what? They actually should feel worse, because it shows, and the president is right, this does not show any kind of collusion, cooperation whatsoever with the Trump campaign. The only collusion there might be that we ought to really look at is what's been going on with the left and the Russians since the election.
Or how about since 1917?
Well, how about that?
Excuses for the
How about
Bolsheviks
that?
for 70 years. Whatever, some of us remember. Rita, thank you. Great to see you.
Thank you.
The next U.S. Census is just 2 years away and could be having your voting power diluted by illegal immigrants. That's a real thing. We'll explain how it works next. At least one politician in Europe is fearlessly raising an alarm about the kind of society European elites want to create, one that is rejected unanimously almost by European citizens. In a speech yesterday kicking off his party's bid for re-election, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban warned that politicians in Brussels, Berlin, and Paris are going to destroy Western civilization with their enthusiasm for mass migration. Left unchecked, he said, Europe could end up with a Muslim majority, while the continent's Christian culture would be blotted out. Orban is not crazy, actually, on a math level here. Hungary's population is below 10 million. Its birth rate is not high. It wouldn't take a huge wave of immigration from Muslim nations to overrun and eventually obliterate a culture that has existed for thousands of years. In America, that's considered a small point. Who cares? But if you've been there for a millennium, maybe you do care. Polls show that more or less most Europeans agree with that. Last year, majorities in Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, and several other countries said they wanted a total freeze on immigration from Muslim countries. Naturally, though, EU leaders denounce Orban as authoritarian. Hilarious. Considering the source, their motto effectively is do what we tell you, or you hate democracy. How's that for Orwellian? Well, this country is set to have its next census in 2020. That's delineated in the Constitution. We have to every 10 years. Unless policies change, the census will be counting illegal aliens the same as everybody else. The census hasn't asked about citizenship status since 1950, meaning that a lot of states get a boost to their congressional representation because of the illegal immigrants in their state. This is a problem. It's not democratic. Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach says it is time to change that, and he joins us tonight. Mr. Secretary, thanks for coming on.
Great to be with you.
So the Constitution says you have to have a census to apportion congressional districts.
Yep.
And so the only people whose information matters are citizens. So it matters whether they're citizens or not, correct?
It absolutely does. Think of it this way. There are 710,000 people per representative in Congress. But if you live in a district like Maxine Waters' district out in California, probably half or more of your district is illegal aliens. And so you may only have 350 citizens voting in your district. Those citizens' vote counts twice as much as my vote or your vote if you live in a district that doesn't have tons of illegal aliens. So you have vote dilution where some people's vote matters more than others because they have tons of illegal aliens in their district.
But wait a second. I thought the liberals are always yelling about how every vote counts, every vote should matter the same as any other vote.
Yeah.
So why would they be for this?
Well, I think it's a dirty little secret that they don't want to talk about. And you're absolutely right. The 1964 decision of the Supreme Court, Westbury versus Sanders, says voting dilution is unconstitutional. You cannot have one congressional district where there are fewer voters than there are in another district. And because of illegal immigration, we have crazy disproportional, extraordinary numbers where, you know, in a Midwestern seat, you might have to get 120,000 votes to win your election. In Waters' district, you might only need 40,000.
So what's the? I don't understand the argument. I mean, the answer is really simple. Just check a box. Are you a citizen or not? Are you allowed to vote legally? That's the whole point of the census. So
exactly.
What's the argument against that?
The only argument against it that I have heard is a really lame one. They say that people will be afraid to answer the census form if it has the citizenship question, which is ridiculous, first of all. And secondly, we already asked the citizenship question on the American Community Survey, which about 1% of the population gets, and the Census Bureau asks that. It's an ongoing survey. The Democrats never complained about that. Only when suddenly we talk about putting the citizenship question back on the census do the people on the left start.
But why should we care if people who aren't allowed to vote in our elections are afraid to answer a census which is designed to apportion congressional districts?
Well, there's that too. If you're illegally in this country, we shouldn't be considering you a resident anyway, because you could go home at any day. You could be deported at any moment. So why in the world would we be worried about counting you?
Why would your feelings matter more than a fair election?
Exactly. And it's not just fair elections, too. Governments need this information. I as Secretary of State, cannot accurately calculate the registration rate, the percentage of eligible people who are registered, unless I know how many citizens I have. And right now, I just have an estimate. I don't have real numbers.
That is crazy. Secretary of State Chris Kobach of Kansas, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Good to see you. We're not huge fans of Congresswoman Maxine Waters, but surely she doesn't tolerate support for suicide bombings. I mean, she's not that crazy or anything. Or maybe she is. That story next. We've had a lot to say about Congresswoman Maxine Waters on this show, but somehow she keeps giving us excuses to say even more. In 2002, Waters attended a Nation of Islam convention. What happened there? Not much, really, except this. Louis Farrakhan showed up, and shortly after celebrating Waters as, quote, a great congresswoman, Louis Farrakhan began praising Palestinian suicide bombers, of course, and then praised Iran for helping arm them. Waters apparently wasn't bothered by this. Of course not. Lawrence Jones is editor-in-chief of Campus Reform, and he joins us tonight. It's like one of those stories. It's like you can't even believe it's real. But I don't think it's going to run in the New York Times tomorrow. Why is that?
Of course it's not, because with the left, they have double standards on what is actually hateful and what's racism. And they have double standards, Tucker. You know, this shouldn't be surprising about the Nation of Islam, because they have been known to rape women within the religion. They have been known to go after people that they dislike and people that leave the faith. Just ask Malcolm X, who got assassinated because he decided to leave the faith. And so this is a pattern with this organization, but the left has different standards on what they feel is hateful, because remember, what they teach on the college campuses today, Tucker, is that if you're not in power, which they consider minorities not in power, then you can't be racist. And this is something that is going to go on for a long time, Tucker, because no one is standing up for free speech. No one is standing against this hateful rhetoric. We try to report it every day at the Leadership Institute's Campus Reform, but a lot of the mainstream media is not covering this.
Well, what's interesting, and I should just say, in the interest of total disclosure and honesty, I know some people in the Nation of Islam who are really nice guys, actually, but there's no defending their, I mean, they are, but there's no defending their core beliefs, which are racist by definition. I mean, they think that God is going to kill all white people. So that's racist, I would say. Isn't it a little patronizing for the press to give Maxine Waters a pass on associating with someone like this as if it doesn't matter? They have such low expectations for her, I guess, that they don't even call her on it? I mean, that's patronizing, I think.
Well, it's not just patronizing, Tucker. It would be different if they were silent on all of these instances of racism. But you know, when it comes to Donald Trump, he doesn't even have to say anything that's actually racist. But in their mind, they can form something that is racist, and you're told that he's vile, and if you support him, then you're a hateful person. But now you have a clear evidence of racism, and they're completely silent on that. And so it's just a bunch of hypocrisy with the press, and I think that's why their approval rating is so low right now with the American people, because they really don't trust the press.
Yeah, it's higher than it deserves to be. It's like how Ted Kennedy could kill a woman and still be considered a great feminist. So, and then there's this picture of Obama with Farrakhan, which was hidden from public view. This was 2005, so it was right before his Senate run. And it was considered too inflammatory for the rest of us to see, and so the press hid it from us. Don't you think we should have had the opportunity to make our own judgments about that?
Yeah, we should have had the opportunity, but the thing is, Tucker, is that the media around in Chicago knew about this. I mean, the Nation of Islam headquarters is in Chicago. They were known to hang out with these elected officials. The question is, not only did they shield this photo, but why did the press refuse to report on this when the local press, as well as the national press, anybody that worked in Chicago knew that they hung out together, but they refused to tell the American people?
Yeah, I mean, Obama had according to a Nation of Islam guy we talked to, had a Nation of Islam employee or adherent working in his Senate office in Illinois. It's like a cover up.
Right,
Lawrence,
it was well known.
Exactly. Lawrence, thank you for that. That was great to see you.
Thanks, Tucker.
Well, the national anthem somehow has become a